Chapter 181. Damn it, who's this old woman? At that moment, a man walked over slowly. What happened? Willow turned around and saw Louis appearing. She then hurriedly walked up to him and said aggrievedly, Louis, I don't know what's going on. They're targeting me deliberately. Madame Nera chuckled. Oh, Mr. Lucas, is she related to you? Why didn't I know that? Willow bit her lip, not daring to look at Maisie's eyes at this time. She was only betting that Maisie did not know about the d'Arma. Louis approached Madame Nera slowly. Madame Nera, I'm sorry, I hope you can forgive my cousin if she has offended you. Heh, but she just vowed that the Lucas family won't show me mercy and let me go unscathed. Louis frowned and glared at Willow coldly. Willow lowered her head and bit her lip harshly. How is this happening, looking at Louis's attitude toward this old hag? Won't the things that I just said slap me in the face? Louis did not want to care about this matter originally, let alone lend Willow a helping hand. But this was related to the reputation of the Lucas family, and it wouldn't do the family any good if Madame Nera were to be offended by Willow. Don't worry, I'll make sure that everything will be answered. Louis turned his head and glared at Willow without his emotionless eyes. You. Apologize to the lady. Louis, Forget it, I'm too old to receive an apology from her. Just ask your mother Larissa to come to me someday. Madame Nera snorted, then turned to Maisie and said, let's go. Okay. Maisie smiled and then pushed the wheelchair away. Louis turned his head and watched as they left. Soon, his expression dimmed. He knew that Madame Nera was not deliberately making things difficult for them, unless, Louis, I'm sorry, it's all my fault, You actually know that you're at fault? Louis glared at her. Inserted his hands into the pockets of his trousers, and said, Don't think that I'll help you just because you're my cousin. If the Lucas family suffers any consequences just because of you, I won't let it slide, even if you're my cousin. Before turning around to leave, he then stopped and said, You better come up with something to explain to my mother. You offended Madame Nera? Larissa stared at Willow coldly with her sharp glare as if there was a bullseye on her face. Willow trembled and bit her lip. I didn't plan to offend Madame Nera. I was only talking to Maisie. It's just that Maisie hates me, so she started speaking rudely to me first, while Madame Nera supported her. Louis stood on the side with his hands kept in his pockets and his lips pressed together tightly, glancing at her without making a sound. Larissa frowned. Forget about Erwin and Nolan, Maisie even has Madame Nera supporting now. Isn't she a little too popular? Apart from that, what was Nolan trying to tell me when he was leaving the other day? If I were to know something, Auntie Larissa, don't worry. I'll go and apologize. What's the use of you apologizing to her? Larissa said sternly, I'm going to ask you again, is what you told me before this all true? If Maisie has always been targeting her and making her life difficult all this while, then why would she be so popular? Let's put Nolan and Erwin aside, Madame Nera is different. The type of person that Madame Nera looks down on most is a scheming woman, thus, since she dared to speak up for that Maisie. It only shows that Maisie must have earned her trust and admiration through some extraordinary traits or her personality. Chapter 182. If it's as she described, and she was only talking to Maisie but got targeted by the latter, there's no reason why Madame Nera, only a bystander at that time, would voice out for such an unreasonable woman. So if I were to look at it from this perspective, it's very likely that Willow was the one who disrespected them first. Auntie, I wouldn't lie to you. I'll find out whether you're lying to me, Willow. If you dare to hide something from me, or even lie to me, I'll never spare you that easily, even if you're Marina's daughter. If my sister has truly given birth to such a scheming daughter, I'd rather not take her in. Willow really panicked and felt extremely unreconciled deep down. How did things come out to be like this? Maisie sent Madame Nera to the ground floor of the Nera Tower. Madame Nera grabbed Maisie's hand. I'm really happy that you accompanied an old lady like me to an afternoon tea today. Because Madame Nera had no children, Maisie was starting to grow on her as the days went by, as she was someone who loved jewelry just like herself. Maisie smiled. I'll brew some tea for you personally if you want to drink tea in the future. There's no need for you to spend money to go to the hotel for the high tea session. Young lady, if you didn't plan to start a new company, I would have asked you to come over to Taylor Jewelry. There wouldn't be any challenge if I were to come over to you. If I wished to make my design the top-notch jewelry in the world, joining Taylor Jewelry would be the fastest way to achieve that. It would definitely be a breeze to allow my jewelry to rise to fame on an international level if I were to launch them under the name of Taylor Jewelry. Madame Nera could see clearly that this young lady's behavior was indeed very low-key. She didn't tell me that she was Zora. Nor did she rely on her relationship with Mr. Goldman to ask for collaboration with me. This shows that she really doesn't want to rely on anyone. This is her best trait that's worth my admiration. Madame Nera's female assistant hurried over and whispered something in her ear. Madame Nera then nodded after listening to what she had to say. I see. Madame Nera, it seems that you're rather occupied. I'll take my leave first then. All right. Madame Nera nodded with a smile. As soon as Maisie entered her office, she saw Nolan sitting on the couch with his legs crossed and reading a jewelry magazine. It seemed that he had been waiting for her for a long time. Without lifting his eyelids, he knew that it was her who had come back. Madame Nera seems to really like you. She had invited his young wife out for tea for such a long time, making him wait for so long. What can I do about my wife's popularity? Maisie looked at him. It's not a bad thing to maintain a good relationship with Madame Nera, by the way. Have you been waiting for me here all this while? Nolan closed the magazine and raised his head. Yeah, I've been waiting for you all this while. I've met your father. Maisie was stunned for a split second. Don't you tell me that you've told my dad about that? Except for the de Arma, I've told him everything that should be told, he responded nonchalantly. That meant, apart from Marina's identity, Nolan had told Stephen about what Willow had done. Nolan put the magazine down, slowly got up, and walked toward her. Aren't you curious about why Willow dared to approach Madame Lucas with your identity? Maisie frowned. Indeed, what has Willow done to convince the Lucas family that she's Marina's daughter, and the main thing is that she has not been exposed yet. Willow was already traveling with the Lucas family's members on the day of the auction, which means she's taken my identity and used it to approach the Lucas since a long time ago. Did your mother leave any item behind after her passing? Nolan asked all of a sudden. Maisie was taken aback and instantly remembered that her father had called her the other day and told her that he was organizing her mother's belongings. Chapter 183. Could it be something that Mom has left behind? Willow returned to the Vanderbilt manor and wanted to talk to her mother and come up with a solution with her mother. Unexpectedly, she saw Stephen sitting on the couch with an obscure expression as soon as she walked in. And for some reason, her mother was kneeling on the side. Dad. What happened to Mom? You still have the face to ask me that. Stephen was so angry that he slammed the table and stood up. You mother and daughter are really shameless. You actually have the guts to steal the bracelet that belongs to Z's mother. If Nolan had not called him and told him that Willow was pretending to be Marina's daughter out there in public, leading him to find out that the bracelet in the box had been missing, he might not have known that his daughter would dare to go to this extent. This was the first time that Madame Vanderbilt saw her son acting this ferociously, so she only sat there and did not dare to say a thing. Willow's expression changed, and she held on to the opening of her sleeve subconsciously. Dad. I don't know what you're talking about. How dare you deny it? Stephen gnashed his teeth. I dare you to tell me now, who's your mother? Is it Marina de Arma or Layla Scott? Layla, who was kneeling on the floor, hugged Stephen's thigh while crying her eyes out. Dear, it's my fault, this is all my fault, please forgive Willie for my sake. You, get away from me. Stephen kicked her away and pointed at her. Your daughter doesn't even want to recognize you as her biological mother. And she even has the balls to say such rebellious things. Do you dare to tell me that this has nothing to do with you? Layla did not expect Steven to find out about it so quickly. This is all over, Steven scolded Willow furiously. Give the bracelet back, otherwise. Don't blame me for being cold-blooded to you. Dad, why must you treat me like this? Willow roared hysterically. I haven't done anything wrong. I've only taken her bracelet. Why should I return it? Maisie has already snatched Nolan from me. So what's wrong with me taking her identity away? Steven grabbed the mug on the table and flung it at her. The mug hit her cheek, and it reddened immediately. Willow clutched her cheek while staring at him blankly. You just hit me. Give the bracelet back. Steven's eyes were filled with pure wrath. Willow took off the bracelet and threw it to the floor angrily. The bracelet was smashed into pieces in an instant. I hate you. Willow ran out of the Vanderbilt manor without looking back. Layla chased out hurriedly. Willie. Steven stepped forward heavily and picked up the shattered bracelet. It was something that he had originally wanted to give to Maisie, but he did not expect it. I can't even protect this bracelet. Madame Vanderbilt rolled her eyes. Isn't it just a bracelet? Look at you. Why must you create a scene out of this? Mother, if you try to be nosy ever again, you should go back to our ancestral mansion. You. Madame Vanderbilt was stupefied. Steven's eyes looked cold as he picked up the broken bracelet and went upstairs without uttering another word to his mother. Madame Vanderbilt was enraged, but she did not dare to vent her spleen. My son, he's rebelling. The night sky was dim. The windows of the car that was parked near the park were fogged, and Layla was lying in the arms of a man with flushed cheeks. Layla stopped the man as he approached her and wanted to leave a hickey on her. You pervert. I'd kill you if I were to be discovered by that old thing when I go home. After saying so, Layla picked up her clothes and put them on slowly. The man lit a cigarette, opened the car's window, started smoking, and snorted. It seems that you've been leading quite a life throughout all these years, especially after marrying Steven Vanderbilt. I thought you had forgotten all your old customers, including me. Layla's expression instantly dimmed at the mention of the phrase old customers. But she did not reveal an annoyed expression. Chapter 184. What are you talking about? How could I forget about you, Nels? Hee, don't you only come to me when you're lonely? Nelson placed his rough fingers on her waist. Layla complained, he has no interest in me, what can I do? Damn it. If it weren't for the sake of conceiving a son, and Steven has been refusing to touch me during this period, why would I come up with such an idea? Steven is the one who's treating me like shit, so he can't blame me for cuckolding him, anyway. Since I was able to bring Willow back to the Vanderbilts and talk him into recognizing her as his daughter, I can definitely give birth to someone else's son and do the same again this time around. Nelson laughed. I think you're surely here because of something else, aren't you? You do know me well, Nels. A hint of viciousness flashed across Layla's face as she said, I'm here because of only one thing. I know what those people who serve you do, so if you're willing to do this one thing for me, I'll definitely pay you a considerable amount of money. Oh? It sounds like a pain in the ass, huh? Nelson said while breathing out smoke. Layla smiled coldly. I have to remove someone from existence for my daughter. The next day, Steven brought a brocade box to the Black Gold group and handed it to Maisie. I didn't expect that Willie would get her hands on your mother's bracelet. Unfortunately, she broke it. I know that you'll have a way to restore it, but it's being returned to its owner now. A bracelet was in the brocade box. However, apart from the parts that were rimmed with gold, the whole bracelet had been shattered into pieces. Steven blamed himself. He had reorganized all these items because he planned to give them all to Maisie. But he did not expect the mother and daughter duo to go into his study and find something that they shouldn't be touching. Thinking of this, Steven could not help but feel regret. Maisie closed the brocade box. I'll restore it. Z, I won't say anything else. As for this matter, I'll surely teach Willie a lesson. I've owed you too much over all these years. Maisie pressed her lips together and lowered her eyes after listening to him. Well, I'm not qualified to say anything about you either. He's my only relative now, so what can I do? Don't worry, I'll divorce Layla after this. You want a divorce? Maisie looked at her father in shock, perhaps because she never imagined that her father would even divorce Layla. Stephen had been thinking about it for a long time. If I hadn't brought them back to the Vanderbilts for Willie's sake, you wouldn't have been wronged back then. I know that you've been complaining and despising me throughout all these years. However, both of them have crossed my bottom line by committing such a misdeed. I was the one who brought harm to you back then. Stephen's expression looked calm. Nolan had actually asked about Maisie when he called him yesterday. He did not expect that his decision to marry Layla back then would overshadow Maisie's childhood so seriously that she still did not believe in marriage at such an age. As a father, he never thought that he would blight his daughter's childhood and affect her whole life. Z, Mr. Goldman is a good man. In my opinion, he treats you very well. In fact, the most important thing in marriage is the relationship between the two people. I sincerely don't wish that you and Mr. Goldman will face the same situation that your mother and I did in the past. Stephen left after saying that. Maisie sat in her seat blankly. Her gaze was then fixed on the broken bracelet lying in the brocade box. Chapter 185. A text message suddenly appeared on the screen of Maisie's cell phone. Maisie retracted her gaze, picked up the phone, and read the content of the text message. Her gaze then changed instantly as she stood up. She ran out of her room in a hurry and ran into Kennedy. Kennedy asked her immediately, Z, what's the matter? My dad is involved in an accident. Maisie did not have the time to explain too much and ran out of the office. Kennedy saw her look flustered. And his expression changed instantly when he heard Maisie say that Stephen was involved in an accident. I should go and tell Mr. Goldman about this. Maisie came to the underground parking lot and saw that her father's car door was open. Her father was lying on the steering wheel motionless. Dad. She was about to walk over to check him out when she was stunned with a taser. She then saw the face of the man who stunned her before she completely lost consciousness. This man, she eventually dropped slowly to the ground. The other two masked men shoved her into a van while the man with the taser pulled his cap down, dashed to the front passenger seat, and got into the van. The van's door was closed, and the van drove away at high speed. In the underground freeway's black market, Maisie woke up gradually in numbness, only to find that she was lying on a cold iron frame bed with her hands and feet locked in chains. What happened? She recalled going to the parking lot to find her father, and then, that man. She looked around the dimly lit room. The mottled and yellow walls were covered with newspapers. There was only a table and an iron bed in the room and no other furniture. She sat up sideways, pulled the chain, and realized it was locked. The door opened all of a sudden, and a few masked men walked inside. Maisie became vigilant subconsciously. Who are you? You don't need to know who we are, we're just people who get paid by accomplishing tasks for others. The man in colorful clothes, who was leading the team, motioned to the men beside him. And two men walked toward her and pressed her against the bed. What are you going to do? If what you want is money, I can give it to you. Maisie struggled as fear spread like wildfire within her. She realized that she might have been set up. Who the hell is it? Don't be nervous. We won't do anything to you. The man walked over to the bed, stretched out his hand, and caressed across her fair cheek. Tisk, TSK, TSK, what a beauty. Maisie's pupils constricted slightly. She kept calming herself down inwardly and said, no matter how much the other party is paying you, I can double the amount. Hee, we don't need the money. The man retracted his hand, put his hand into his pocket, and took out a syringe. Maisie's expression changed slightly. What are you going to do to me? Hold her down. The man ignored her question. And the man beside her pressed her against the bed tightly. The person holding the syringe then pulled her hand out. Stop, stop. The needle pierced into her arm, and her muscles did not relax under such a tense condition. When the man injected the cold liquid into her, the pain caused the whole arm to become numb. Let go of me. Maisie could only feel that the blood all over her body began to heat up, while all her senses and perception became abnormal due to the drug that was flowing in her body. The man chuckled. Good girl, this thing won't kill you. It's just that it's a little addictive. Maisie could not stay calm when she heard the word addictive. You dickhead, let me go. Maisie gnashed her teeth, but not only was she unable to exert any strength, but she even started to sweat in her palms. She felt very light. And under the ecstasy's effects, she felt that the scenes around her had begun to change. She could not hear what they were saying and felt that the whole ceiling was swirling. Chapter 186. Nolan? Maisie thought the man next to her looked like Nolan, but he slowly sat up and moved toward her. What did you call me? Maisie raised her hand meekly to hold the man's collar but realized the man wasn't Nolan, so she immediately pushed him away. She turned around, and there were a few men that looked identical. They put out their hands toward her with evil smiles. Ah! Maisie hugged her head, screaming her head off because she could no longer control her emotions. The terror on her face replaced her beauty. This drug is really strong. Seeing she had almost lost her mind, the men knew that the drug had taken effect. I'll give the rest to her tomorrow. The men turned to leave, but the door was opened. Someone had budged in. The people inside looked pale. They saw a lame man with a cane walk in with a few burly-looking men. He removed his hat. Give that woman to me. Gerald, what are you? You kidnapped Mr. Goldman's lover and brought her to my place. Are you trying to get me in trouble? The lame man looked pale. He hit the man with his cane. Mr. Goldman's lover, she. Who instructed you to do this? Nelson asked me to kidnap the daughter of Stephen Vanderbilt. We didn't know. Gerald pointed his cane at him. I won't be able to save Nelson Baker. Get him to run as far as he can. Send this woman to the hospital immediately. Mr. Goldman is searching for her now. If my place is trashed, I'm going to beat you up. There's trouble. A boy ran in. Gerald, Mr. Goldman's men are here. Gerald was stunned, gave him a hard stare, and walked out with his cane. The casino was in chaos. One of the gamblers was hugging his head in a corner, while the fighters that had been beaten badly laid on the floor, unable to get up. Mr. Goldman, I'm so sorry, my men have been blinded and kidnapped your woman. I've tried to stop them, please forgive us. This chaos had caused him a huge loss, but offending the Goldmans would be a different type of nightmare. Even though they were all desperados running illegal businesses, they knew who not to anger. If they offended the Boucher, the worst-case scenario was that they would be put in jail with a record. However, they might lose a lot more than their freedom if they angered the Goldman. Goldman stretched. Who did it? It was Nelson. He was instructed to kidnap your woman, but don't worry. I'll report to you when I get my hands on him. Gerald was the leader of the gangsters, but he was nothing compared to the Goldman. To protect his place, he had to hand Nelson over since this all had happened because of him. Nolan walked to him and looked down. I'll give you 3 days to hand him over. If not, you can say goodbye to your entire underground business. Yes, I'll do as you say, Gerald replied with beads of sweat on his brows. Maisie was brought out, but she looked as though she was in a trance since her mind wasn't clear. Nolan went over to get her. Her body was cold, and her eyes were empty. The few men noticed the cold atmosphere and shuddered. Mr. Goldman, don't worry, we didn't do anything to her, we just gave her a shot. Chapter 187. Nolan's eyes were filled with anger. What was in it? Nolan kicked the man before he could finish and collapsed on the ground. Nolan's eyes were red with fury. How could you give that to her? The man didn't care about the pain caused by the fracture and frantically tried to explain, it wasn't a big dose. They needed to give her shots for 3 consecutive days to get her hooked. She would just feel terrible for a few days if it was one shot. But they never expected Nolan to find them. Nolan carried Maisie with both arms and turned to stare at them. If anything happens to her, it'll be the end of you. In the car, Nolan held Maisie in his arms. Her hands were cold, no matter for how long he rubbed them. Z? Nolan spoke to her, but Maisie just looked up at him, a little slow. Nolan hugged her tight, his eyes dark and jaw clenched. Quincy, drive faster. All right. Quincy stepped on the accelerator, and the car sped up. The drug's effects came and went as Maisie was rushed to the hospital. She almost lost her mind because of the unusual emotional swings, causing her to hurt the doctor attending to her. Get away from me, go, leave. Z. Nolan grabbed her hand and hugged her. Z, it's me. Don't be afraid. You're at the hospital, and no one will hurt you here. Maisie suddenly bit his shoulder. Nolan winced, but didn't push her away, still holding her tight. Mr. Goldman. The doctor closest to him and Quincy walked close to help make Maisie let go. But Maisie was filled with hatred, her eyes feral. The doctor immediately administered a sedative, and Maisie soon let go. A very deep bite mark could be seen through Nolan's shirt. Maisie slowly laid down, her breathing stabilized. The doctor wiped off his sweat and said, the drug causes hallucinations, but she didn't have a lot in her system. She will suffer for a few days while we treat her. Nolan was quiet. The pain in his heart was far greater than the pain in his shoulder. Quincy frowned. Some people took the drug she was given just to feel a little more excited, and it was sold. Commonly in the black market from hundreds of dollars to thousands. He had seen people who used it lose control over their emotions because they couldn't cope in the beginning. It made them unstable. But if they continuously took it, they would start getting addicted, just like Japan. People who took it frequently would be able to function normally and could even control their hallucinations, but the more they were hooked, the bigger the dose they needed. It wouldn't cause death, but if taken over a long period, it would cause schizophrenia, self-harm, and in the worst case, they would lose their sanity. This hallucinogen had broken up many families and lives. Who would be cruel enough to give this to Maisie? He could be sure that no matter who did it, they were going to be in grave danger. 3 days later, Nelson had gotten his money and was getting ready to flee, but Gerald caught him and brought him to Nolan. He was half gone from being beaten to a pulp and sustaining fractures all over his body. He was dragged to Nolan's feet by 2 men in black, covered in blood. Mr. Goldman, he said that it was Layla who asked him to do this. Layla wanted Ms. Vanderbilt to get addicted. Chapter 188. Quincy walked over and slowly opened his mouth. This stepmother was too cruel. She would ruin Maisie to secure her daughter's future. With his last breath, Nelson looked up at Nolan, sitting cross-legged on the chair. He looked like the devil straight out from the depths of hell. He had no expression on his face, while his amber eyes were cold and sharp, making him look devilish. Nolan uncrossed his legs into a new sitting position. He leaned forward and looked down at him. If you admit it, I'll let you live. Nelson's eyes filled with tears as he saw hope. But what Nolan said next took out all the shine in his eyes and only left them with fear. Break his hands and legs, spread the word that whoever tries to save him will suffer the same consequences. Nolan got up and left without looking back. Quincy signaled the men with his eyes and followed Nolan out. Gerald brought his men in to check long after they left. Seeing how terrible Nelson looked, Gerald shuddered. See what happened to Nelson, learn who not to anger. Or you'll end up like him. Nelson lectured his men. Yes, sir. The men obeyed, not wanting to suffer the same fate. If their limbs were broken and they could not get treatment, they would just end up being disabled for life. If they had a choice, they would rather go to jail with their limbs intact. Maisie's health improved after a few days of treatment. She couldn't remember much of what had happened that day except the vague memory of hurting someone. When the doctor came in to check on her, he asked, "Ms. Vanderbilt, how are you feeling today?" "Thank you, I feel much better now." Seeing her communicating clearly, the doctor was relieved. "You should be glad you didn't get a big dose, or it wouldn't be as simple as coming to the hospital. She would have to be sent to rehab. That would be even worse than what she had suffered for the past few days." Maisie looked up. "Doctor, can I know what was injected?" "It's a hallucinogen called Dipan. It's for medical research, a medication that causes hallucinations. Our bodies will reject it at first. Those that have mild rejections won't have bad hallucinations. However, those who have serious rejections, like you, lose consciousness. It's very addictive and hard to recover from it," the doctor explained. Maisie pressed her lips together. She had guessed as much when the man said something about addiction. The doctor checked the results of her blood test and asked, "By the way, your blood is really unique. Have you had some medication before this?" Maisie was surprised. "There's more than the hallucinogen?" The doctor was troubled. "Yes, but you're recovering quickly. Under normal circumstances, it would take about a week to get it out of your system, but this hallucinogen seems to have almost completely disappeared." "You're awake, Ms. Vanderbilt?" Quincy walked in, cutting off the doctor.
Chapter 189. Maisie suddenly remembered something when she saw Quincy and asked, "Where's Nolan?" "He went back for a change of clothes. He sent me over." Quincy smiled. "He probably didn't want to stain his shirt with blood." "Quincy, did I bite Nolan?" Maisie asked. She remembered that she had bitten someone, and she thought she had heard Nolan's voice. Quincy smiled. "You remembered." Maisie looked down. It was true. She continued asking, "Do the children know that I'm in the hospital?" She hadn't been home for a few days. What would the children think? Quincy answered, "You weren't stable for the past few days. Nolan covered it up, because he didn't want them to worry." Maisie nodded. It was true. If Waylon and the others came to see her here and she wounded them, Maisie would feel horrible. "And my father?" "Your father is fine." Nolan walked in. The doctor and Quincy left, giving them time to be alone. He sat down next to the bed. His handsome face looked tired, but he wasn't bothered. He was just stunned. When Maisie drifted off, Nolan pulled her into his arms. The sudden warmth surprised her. "Z, you really got me worried. Please don't do anything alone if anything happens in the future, promise me." Nolan admitted that he had lost his cool when he saw her losing her mind. That was something he had never felt before. It had felt like if he just loosened his grip, the woman would disappear forever. What should he do with her? Nolan. Nolan looked at her. Maisie looked straight at him. "Take off your clothes." Nolan paused, his deep-set eyes filled with curiosity. But he smiled helplessly. "I'm not going to bully a patient." Maisie ignored him and started taking off his custom-made suit. Nolan was wondering if this woman of his was starting to make a move, but should he play along? Maisie wasn't thinking. She unbuttoned his shirt and pushed the right shoulder of the shirt off. The bite mark was purplish red, a big patch of it. Nolan suddenly pushed her onto the bed. Maisie was stunned. This half-undressed man with the most beautiful face was getting closer. But this seduction had made her mind go blank. Nolan's lips slowly touched hers, more gentle than usual. He started with pecks, before going all in. Maisie didn't push him away as her hands were held down. Z-dash. The door was opened. Maisie snapped back into reality and pushed away Nolan, who was on top of her. Mr. Goldman Sr. was standing at the door, looking shocked. You rascal, Z isn't out of the hospital yet, and you can't even control yourself already. Nolan was rendered speechless. Maisie sat up and awkwardly explained. It's a misunderstanding, we didn't dash. Z, you're still recovering, don't give in to this man, take care of yourself. Mr. Goldman Sr. cut her off with kind advice. Dad, you think that I would? Put your clothes back on before you speak. Nolan was again rendered speechless. Chapter 190. At the Vanderbilt mansion, a clear, loud slap fell on Layla's face, putting her in a state of shock. When Stephen found out that Layla was behind Maisie's abduction, he shook in anger while he barked, You horrible woman. I've never treated either of you badly all these years. But you. How could you do this to Maisie while I'm still breathing? Layla trembled with her hand on her cheek. She never expected the plan with Nelson to fail. It was all because of Nolan. There was no point for Layla to explain herself, but she realized that Stephen was furious. Listen to me, dear. What else do you have to say? Stephen was utterly disappointed in her. I've always thought that you were sincerely nice to Maisie, that you're a good stepmother, but now I know that I had been too naive. He finally understood why Maisie wouldn't accept this mother and daughter duo. They were such cruel women, but he had sent Maisie away because of them. He had almost caused the end of his daughter. Stephen slammed the divorce papers on the desk. I wanted to give you another chance. But there's no need for that now. You want a divorce? Looking at the divorce papers, she lost her cool. Yes, I want a divorce, Stephen said with full sincerity. He couldn't care about the years they had spent together anymore. He had made up his mind. Layla crawled to his feet and held on. Stephen, please don't do this to me. I've been by your side for so many years and gave you a daughter, you can't do this to me. Stephen paused. Layla had called him Stephen, bringing him back to the time when they had first met. Layla had been a pure and gentle woman at that time, but now it seemed that everything was a facade. Seeing that he was responding, she continued. Steph, I know what I've done, I only did it because I've lost my mind, but I never thought of putting Maisie in danger. I just wanted to threaten her. It was all for Willow. I only have Willow, and all these years, she was labeled a child out of wedlock. Do you think I feel good about that? She loved Mr. Goldman so much and stayed with him for 6 years, but she was pushed aside because of Maisie, yes. Maisie had a better namesake, and she's capable and smart. Sometimes I wish my daughter was like her. But had Maisie not done anything to hurt my daughter, how do you think Willie got those designs? It was all because Z worked with Freddie to frame her. What did Willie do wrong? Layla complained on behalf of her daughter. Stephen took a deep breath and looked at her. When you and Willie framed her 6 years ago, did you imagine it would come back to haunt you now? I've done my daughter wrong all these years because I've loved Willie too much, but Z. She never got the love she deserved from me. While she blamed me, did she do anything to the both of you? Stephen stared at her, squaring his jaw. If I hadn't done you wrong, I wouldn't have brought you back home. I never wanted Willie to be the child out of wedlock. But were my actions fair to Maisie? It wasn't fair, but in the end, you still chose to hurt her.